Thank you, everybody, for coming to this virtual Constitution Day. I'm Professor Sarah Crabtree, and I'm really excited to welcome our two guests for this panel today. I'll introduce both of them, and then we'll talk about this really important work. So Dr. Katherine Marino is an associate professor at UCLA. She researches and teaches about 20th century US and Latin American history, particularly as they relate to histories of women, gender, sexuality, race, and empire in the Americas. She has published widely, including articles in the Journal of Women's History, Gender in History, and Frontiers, a journal of women's studies. But we are here today to discuss her first book, which is entitled Feminism for the Americas, The Making of an International Human Rights Movement. And that was published last year, 2019, with UNC Press. This outstanding work has received multiple awards and recognitions by professional organizations, including the Latin American Studies Association, the Western Association of Women Historians, the Organization of American Historians, and the International Studies Association. So thank you, Katherine, for joining us today.
Thank you.
And then our second box is Dr. Michael Aguirre. He's a postdoctoral fellow with the Inequality in America Initiative at Harvard University. He obtained his PhD in history from the University of Washington. His work has appeared in the edited collection Chicano Movidas, that's with UT Press in 2018, and the Southern California Quarterly. He is also a fellow with the World Economic Forum's New Equality and Inclusion Agenda. He's working on a book manuscript, a post-1960 history of the Imperial Mexicali borderlands, focused on questions of political economy, labor, and healthcare. And Michael will be an assistant professor at the University of Nevada-Reno starting next fall. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
So again, thanks to the two of you for joining us. And Katherine, I'll just ask the first question, which is just a little bit, could you set the stage? When we think about the traditional narrative of the 19th Amendment, of the sort of women's suffrage campaign here in the United States, it tends to be a very insular story. A story that's sort of confined to US borders and also confined to a particular time period. So first, I wonder if you could just take us through a little bit of your work, how you found it to be international, what inspired you to start asking these questions.
Thanks so much for this conversation and for that great question. My book was inspired by an interest in looking at how US feminists and suffragists were organizing transnationally, and basically emerged out of finding a really interesting relationship between a US former suffragist and a Brazilian feminist, which I realized their friendship was part of a much bigger network of inter-American feminist organizing in the interwar years especially. So I found that a lot of suffragists in the US after the 19th Amendment in 1920 started to turn their sights on international activism. And a lot of US feminists especially started organizing in Pan-American initiatives with Latin American feminists. And so that's really what my book is about. Increasingly, as I did my research though, I became more and more interested in how Latin American feminists themselves were talking to each other sometimes when they weren't talking to US feminists that they were organizing with. I became as much interested in these South-South connections of Latin American suffragists as their connections with US women. And that was in part because US feminists often maintain some sort of organizational leadership over a lot of Pan-American feminist groups and define feminism in particular ways that that were often narrower than how Latin American feminists defined it. But really, I mean, the outcome of this movement and these conflicts, which I think are just as important as the collaborations transnationally, was that these inter-American feminist ventures ended up being critical to the development of human rights, of international human rights instruments. It was a group in 1945 also of Latin American feminists, all of whom had cut their teeth on 2 decades of Pan-American feminist organizing, who pushed women's rights into the UN Charter, and whose work had also laid vital groundwork for that notion, for that framing of human rights in the UN Charter around rights regardless of race, class, sex, or religion. And so those international treaties and mechanisms that were coming out of these Pan-American conferences and then the UN Charter actually were used in suffrage movements throughout Latin America, in legislative and judicial decisions in Latin America regarding women's civil equality and political equality. They would cite the UN Charter, they would cite inter-American feminist conventions for women's political and civil equality. And so the book is at once trying to sort of show the real Latin American feminist vitality in these years that I think we sometimes overlook. In our narratives of global feminism, we often position the US and Western Europe as sort of the innovators of feminism and see it trickling down to other parts of the world, especially the third world or the global South. And in my book, I was trying to demonstrate that actually Latin American feminists were really in the vanguard globally and were critical to global feminism and to international human rights.
And what I find really interesting about the timeline that you're laying out is the theme of the conference is sort of, the 19th Amendment, but also the unfinished work of suffrage. And I'd like to really get into kind of the broader agenda of these Latin American feminists and how they had a more inclusive understanding of a human rights agenda. But just in terms of a timeline, I mean, there's kind of this big gap when we talk about the sort of traditional story of women's rights in the United States, that we have this quote unquote first wave that's pushed with suffrage, and then the second wave sort of grows out of, the student rights movement, the Black freedom movement of the 1960s. And this interwar period is really crucial for your work. Mm-hmm. So is it that American feminists dropped out of the conversation? Is that they were never part of this broader conversation? They weren't sort of at the vanguard, as you say?
Well, I think that feminism after the 19th Amendment, in its sort of how it was used in the United States, the meaning did narrow somewhat after, especially after the National Women's Party introduced into US Congress the Equal Rights Amendment, which was divisive at the time and sort of actually came to define how the US defined feminism around sort of this strict legal equality of absolute political and civil equal rights under the law. And although today, progressive groups are trying to revive the ERA and get it ratified, at the time it actually was, in terms of progressive women's organizing, the National Women's Party was actually a bit conservative because they were excluding African-American women's struggles and notions of social justice. For instance, they were so singularly set on the ERA that they didn't embrace Black women's anti-lynching agendas or other causes of Black women. They also sort of gained the opprobrium of labor feminists who believed the ERA would eliminate protective labor legislation. So I think that that's just one, even though I think our historical understanding of women's activism in this period is obviously much broader than how feminism, the word, was used at the time. I think that's some important context to understanding the fact that Latin American feminists who embraced socialist causes, who were anti-racist, who were arguing for maternity legislation and labor rights as well as civil and political equality, use this term feminism in a much more expansive way than in the US. At the same time, I think that there's a lot more that historians have been uncovering about the vitality of the 1930s, especially in terms of women's activism, especially if you're looking at women's labor activism. And I think that, I in my own work saw how there were connections between labor women and socialist women organizers in the US with some of these networks that I was looking at. I mean, there are numerous examples. Luisa Marino, for instance, was organizing around an anti-fascist feminism, even if she didn't use the word feminism in these years, but she was also demanding rights for all Mexicans and Mexican Americans in the United States. And Eric McDuffie has written a great book about African-American communist women, and he really shows that long, legacy, the critical years of the 1930s, these years of the Popular Front, how critical that was to this articulation of a triple oppression against Black women. And you see that in these, in some of these Latin American feminist venues that I'm looking at as well. I just think that this broader, more expansive notion of a feminism that addressed working women's rights, it was part of the mainstream to a much greater extent than it was in the United States. And so one thing that I found so interesting was that you have these Latin American feminists who are actually teaching US women in the Children's Bureau and the Women's Bureau about how they should be fighting for maternity legislation. And they were just they incorporated the reality that women were working, that mothers were working. Latin American feminists, much more than US feminists at this time, realized that this was a reality and that needed to be addressed. And they really acknowledged that in their feminist agendas.
Can I jump in really quick, Sarah?
Please.
Yeah, so Katherine, do you think that shift was a product of the Great Depression and lots of labor organizing that was happening because of the Great Depression, or do you think it was something else? Because the women, like a lot of the women that you talk about in your book, you point out that they're very elite women, right? They're in the sense that they have like education and very extensive formal education. So how did their organizing, their feminist, larger inter-American organizing capture the wants and needs of essentially much more lower class and middle class workers?
Right, that's a great question, and it's something I've been thinking about since publishing the book too. I mean, one thing is that I think there's just a much more robust incorporation of social rights in notions of politics in Latin America, starting with the Revolutionary Constitution of Mexico in 1917, which becomes a model throughout the hemisphere, and really even sort of writes in maternity legislation for working women into the Constitution. I mean, obviously it's not like that created some idyllic, utopia for working women in Mexico, but it is an important, standard that I think gets incorporated much more readily into these Latin American feminist ideologies. The other thing is that a lot of them, even if they were, Clara Gonzalez, her parents were not formally married. So she would have been in this sort of illegitimate status that, she and other feminists were kind of arguing for the rights of, so, I think she did though absolutely benefit from a, lighter skin and from access to education. She was the first female lawyer in Panama. But she, and Ofelio Dominguez Navarro, for instance, and Marta Vergara, they all were really anti-imperialist. And this was another strain that I saw even before the 1930s, was this robust acknowledgement of the way that US capitalism was part of US imperialism, and this sort of anti-capitalist, an acknowledgement of how political economy was not only hurting their countries, but was hurting workers in their countries and women workers too. So I think that there's even before the Great Depression, although that certainly is what kind of, I think catalyzes a broader, as I put it in the book, Popular Front Pan-American Feminism. I think even before that, there is more of a robust acknowledgement of critique of capitalism and feminism in Latin America. But I also do think, obviously, the Great Depression and the labor organizing that emerged, the profusion of socialist and communist parties that started developing throughout the region, and the way that also fascism was viewed as particularly harmful to women workers, it sort of created a critical context for this leftist feminism that emerged.
Thank you, Katherine.
Thanks.
Yeah, I wonder if I could just build on your points and Michael's points here, and that's that, you talk specifically in your book that the feminist vision for Latin America is inextricably linked to an anti-racist agenda, an anti-colonial agenda. And certainly, you know, there are feminists in the United States, working class women, African American women, who have these sort of same critiques of capitalism, critiques of colonialism, you know, sort of anti-racist agendas. But how, you know, how and why, I guess, is Latin American feminism different? How is it leading on these issues? How do these women sort of come to see these issues that you can't address one without addressing the other?
Mm-hmm.
And how can we learn from that vision of feminism, that legacy of feminism?
Right. I mean, I guess before, that's a great question. And I just want to clarify too, that I'm not saying that all variants of Latin American feminism were anti-racist and anti-colonial by any stretch. I mean, that is how I'm sort of defining this variant of Popular Front Pan-American feminism that was really kind of intersectional and thinking about multiple things together. But of course, there were racist feminists throughout Latin America, and that was a strong variant too. There are also Catholic feminists who, you know, all of the women I'm really focusing on were secular and believed Catholicism was harmful to feminism. But I'm really also looking at how they're developing this agenda for an inter-American movement. So all of the people I'm looking at are very self-consciously organizing transnationally. And I think that that's key to sort of how they start to think of a multi-pronged agenda. And, you know, from the start, their feminism is never a one-issue feminism. And I think that that's where they really clash with US feminists who try to limit their agenda to suffrage. I mean, I also think that the realities of, you know, in terms of some countries like Cuba under Machado, the Dominican Republic under Trujillo, suffrage isn't even desirable for a lot of these Latin American feminists who are saying why we can't, nobody has real political rights right now. What we need to do is a more structural sort of, have a more structural change in our societies that would really grant people political and social justice and equality. That never really resonated with the US feminist who led this organization, the Inter-American Commission of Women. And that was Doris Stevens, this former US suffragist who was so singularly attached really to a single issue kind of politics around just equal rights under the law, that she even allied and collaborated with dictators in this period. So I think that these Latin American feminists were fairly sophisticated in realizing that their agenda would not only incorporate sort of multiple goals, but also shift according to different local, you know, contexts. And they were capable of saying, you know, we want suffrage in Mexico, for instance, but the goal in the Dominican Republic should be anti-fascism, and so I think that is another, they didn't have a sort of one-size-fits-all approach to transnational feminism.
Katherine, do you think that was maybe a bit of a challenge for this organization? Not necessarily one size fits all, but that the plan, the agenda was so pliable, was so plastic, right? So when you mentioned race and you know, racial thinking differs between countries, right? You're talking about, you know, South America all the way to, you know, to the Central American countries, including Mexico. And so, you know, race is a very, very different discussion if you're talking about even say within Mexico between what's going on in the central part versus say the eastern part of the country and so forth. The same thing in the Dominican Republic and in Cuba, right? Very differences there. But was that, I guess, missing real strict policy? Was that, do you see any kind of shortcomings with that type of policy?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, one blueprint for this sort of collection of different goals was this 1934 anti-fascist women's conference that happened in Paris that the Uruguayan feminist Paulina Luisi was really involved in. And that was where actually the 4 African-American women from the United States, one of whom was a sharecropper in Alabama, came with as representatives of the Communist Party. And this is the first iteration that I've ever seen of a feminist conference calling out racism, colonialism. They had representatives there, you know, from the Dutch Indies who were condemning, you know, the imperialism of the Netherlands, and so the colonialism anyway. And you have a Mexican communist feminist who's speaking out against US imperialism. And I think there are ways in which some of these leftist feminists in Mexico and in other places called out US racism and Jim Crow as a way of combating US imperialism, but sometimes they were not turning that anti-racist lens onto their own countries. But I also see Ofelia Dominguez Navarro in Cuba, for instance, where there was a robust participation of Afro-Cuban women in the Communist Party and in feminist organizing, even though they experienced racism from white feminists. By 1939, they were in their National Women's Conference calling out the racism that Black women in Cuba experienced in sophisticated ways. And, you know, Ofelia Dominguez Navarro was learning from them this language. Actually, she called it triple aggression as early as 1938 about racism that Black women experienced in Cuba and the way that Black women were uniquely oppressed based on race, class, and gender. So, I mean, I think you're right. I think it really depends on the different context. And I think that not everyone incorporated. You know, I really found that Indigenous women's voices were missing from a lot of these conversations. Although, and, you know, you have some sort of lip service to their rights, you know, even in, they do start talking about Indigenous women's rights. And in this 1945 conference in Chapultepec before the UN conference, you have Minerva Bernardino and Amalia Castillo-Ledon talking about the rights of all women of all races, and they enumerate Indigenous women, Black women, and Latin American women. That's how they categorize these. So, I mean, they're thinking about this, but I also don't see always the sort of this put into action. At the same time, I really think that, you know, the book is, one of the goals is really to sort of open up new research. I mean, my book really follows these international conferences, and I wasn't able to get into the nitty-gritty of all of the different contexts, but I really have found, you know, such fascinating things in Ecuador, vital Indigenous women's activism in these years. And so I really think things are shifting in the 30s and 40s, and I just hope that that it helps open the door for new research that can delve into the experiences and feminism of women who are too often overlooked and who didn't have the access to these international conferences.
Yeah, I mean, I had said when I reached out to you that this part of your book really reminded me of sort of the double V for victory campaign that we talk about with African Americans in World War II, fighting fascism abroad and at home, right? So there's this element of, and this is a different kind of triple than you just invoked, but the idea that they're fighting sort of, you know, sexism, colonialism, and then this third lens of sort of turning it inward and thinking about racism and oppression and classism within their own societies.
Right.
And what I found really interesting was this period after World War I, where in your book you say that the sort of the idealization of maybe European civilization or progressivism, or, you know, they're sort of leading the way on human rights discourse is really destroyed by the Great War. And you know, one of the reasons that I had invited Michael to participate is I'm really interested in this trans-border activism that that I don't know if I want to say emerges or grows between the United States and Latin American countries. So can you talk a little bit about, I mean, when we think about transnational feminism, usually we think about the British feminists and the American feminists being in conversation, but I think what your work, and then, you know, what Michael's work does too, is refocus our conversation on really early collaborations between US activists on labor and activists on anti-racism and activists on feminism, the way that it's a truly holistically American conversation, right? And that the two continents, progressives, leftists, radicals in both of in these spheres are in conversation with one another and moving forward toward maybe a unified agenda is overstating it, but they're working in concert with one another on both sides of the border.
Right, yeah. Yeah, and I would love to hear more about Michael's work too on this subject. So is your question sort of about how that develops after World War I, or, yeah.
Very long way, winded way of asking that, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what I found was that the term Pan-Americanism came to provide this sort of institutional apparatus for just numerous new conferences that weren't always just US led, but were really sort of Latin American led around scientific exchange, social welfare, hygiene, medicine. They included Pan-American conferences on eugenics too that Latin Americans were invested in. But that this notion of, yes, of European cultural superiority is really shattered by the First World War. And so it's an opportunity in a way for a lot of Latin American nations to kind of position themselves on the world stage. And you see this also in this sphere of international law where Latin American jurists are trying to reframe the Monroe Doctrine so that it's more multilateral. There's just a tremendous amount of innovation happening in the Pan-American realm. And so feminists really, capitalize on that. And at the same time, there's these feminists engage in these Pan-American encounters and invariably find that they're being sort of talked down to by US counterparts. And so I found that Pan-Hispanism was just as important and more important perhaps as sort of a cultural ideology among especially Spanish-speaking feminists. This idea that really emerged around, especially after the 1898 and the Spanish-American War, this idea that Spanish-American culture was inherently more communitarian, less materialistic, less imperialist than the U.S., and I see and superior than an Anglo-American culture. And I think that a lot of Latin American feminists who participated in Pan-American ventures were also sort of, passionate about Pan-Hispanism and were kind of organizing with each other, sometimes unbeknownst to their US counterparts.
Yeah, that's a really good point where, just the terms that you bring up, right? Considering the fact that you profile, a Brazilian, right? And so how does the Lusophone world fit into these, terms like, Pan-Latinidad or Pan-Hispanism, right? Like it's very, very quite interesting. And I think it shows how quite pliable and how flexible, right, these terms are, that they're not strictly based, say, on nationalism, but they're really based on these kind of broader goals, which I think you've outlined, with against U.S. imperialism and against U.S. imperialism, both in the military sense and the capitalist sense, but also in this very kind of top-down feminist sense, right, coming from the U.S. down to Latin America. And so my work focuses much more on, I focus much more on the post-1960s, and I did that for a reason. I first of all wanted to kind of move the chronological meter, so to speak, away from the Bracero program, and I focus much more on U.S.-Mexico relations and Mexicans in the diaspora. And yeah, there is most of the people that I've talked to, whether they be activists in Seattle, where they kind of break away from the second wave, right? And they don't consider themselves part of the second wave. They also don't consider themselves feminists, right? They consider themselves just part of either what they call the family, right? They call themselves, la raza or la familia. So in a way, many of them saw using the label of feminist or the term of feminist or adopting that word, that it would be divisive, right? That it would be divisive and that it would present a singular issue, which I think you talk about, stretching back all the way to the, to the turn of the century. that it would be too singular, and they're much more focused on this intersectional approach around the interstices of being women and being a part of communities, marginalized communities of color in the United States. So there are feminists in I shouldn't say feminists. There are Chicanas in Seattle, right? That definitely they're trying to organize in a very, very multiracial framework. Also on the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. So I look in particular at the United Farm Workers. It was one of the, it's the biggest labor organization that the Imperial Valley, which is the place that I focus on, well, like 4 hours away from you, Katherine, 4.5 hours southeast. It's the biggest labor organization there, as well as maquiladora workers prior to the boom that happens in the early 80s. And so they're not really, as far as maquiladora workers, they're not necessarily, I have not come across any document where they call themselves feminists, right? They'll work within kind of like what Emma Perez calls this feminism, this feminism and nationalism, which is like using these very nationalist institutions, say like the labor arbitration courts of the state of Baja California and the Mexican federal government, and they'll try to work through those to kind of try to undermine the spread of U.S. capitalism on the northern Mexican border, with varying success. But they're using this avenue that's available to them to really chastise public officials and government officials for allowing essentially these companies to take over and undermine what they consider their sense of Mexicanidad, right? Their sense of worth as Mexicans and as Mexican women. And the other component is with the United Farm Workers, this is where the healthcare component comes in, because a lot of the organizing that happens revolves around families that live on the Mexican side of the border that can't cross the U.S. to receive healthcare that the United Farm Workers were offering in the Imperial Valley. The Imperial Valley had one of the UFW clinics in California. They had the second one there. And again, much of it revolved around the language of providing for dependents, right? And this didn't come about amorphously. It came about really by a push by women whose husbands were under contract with the union and were union members to really get this going, right? So this notion that healthcare, the transborder healthcare, somehow came about by good graces. No, it was definitely about women pushing and trying to get this union to respond to their wants and to their needs. But again, even within the union, I did not come across people who would consider themselves feminists, right? They consider themselves as part of a much broader network, in this particular case, a labor union.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the parallel that I saw between both of your work and why I was so interested in it is the sort of expansive nature of understanding of the intersectionality of these issues. But Michael, it sounds like what you're saying is that this is in some ways put within a nationalist framework and a nationalist struggle, right? I mean, also within the context of a union, but there's very much sort of a Chicano nationalism, part of the liberation movements in the post-World War II. And Katherine, I wonder, these women are also, on the world stage at times of important nationalist revolutions. You sort of use the Mexican Revolution as a touchstone in the beginning when you started talking about their activism. How do they balance internationalism and nationalism during this really fraught period where, of course, both in Europe and in some Latin American countries, we see this nationalism ultimately turn to fascism, sort of this hyper-violent nationalism?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I saw it in different ways. I mean, Clara Gonzalez in Panama was definitely a nationalist in that she wanted the US to, not have sovereignty over the Panama Canal. But at the same time, that demand of rejecting US sovereignty over Panama Canal was also part of a transnational movement of, the Aprista movement, for instance, which made that one of its critical goals. So I found ways in which, in the 30s, the nationalization of Mexican oil was also part of this broader transnational movement of the Popular Front. So there were ways in which understanding Latin American nationalism was actually part of a transnational sort of Popular Front movement that rejected US empire. But I also, what Michael was saying reminded me also of the ways in which, not all communist women embrace this term feminism too. It was, in Ecuador, Nela Martinez, who was critical to women's rights activism and was a communist leader and the first woman in Ecuador to be part of their Congress and Parliament in the 40s. I think it was 1944. She made a speech in which she kind of distanced herself, saying, "I'm not an old style sour feminist," or something like that. But she really was in simpatico with these Popular Front, so, there were people who, but then, meanwhile, I'm doing more research on a really fascinating Afro-Panamanian feminist named Felicia Santizo, who was a member of the Communist Party in Panama. The US surveilled her assiduously during the 1950s from their, from the Canal military bases. But she herself, even in the 50s, was embracing this term feminism, even though she was, a communist. So it's just really interesting, because I do think the Cold War kind of marks a shift in how some of these women on the left use this word. I think that there is a way in which globally feminism comes to be attached to a sort of first world United States and Western Europe political and civil equality kind of agenda. And even though a lot of women who are socialist and who are anti-colonial throughout, the global South are promoting women's rights, they sometimes don't use that term feminist because they associate it with a first world agenda. And you see this in Cuba too. And so I think that term does sort of, and the same with, even the term human rights, I think that gets sort of shifts a little bit in the post-Cold War years. So, but I also think that, class has a lot to do with it too. I mean, that's why I found it so remarkable that in the 1930s, there is this real flourishing of groups that really are organizing with working women on a broad scale, and not just in metropolitan centers in Latin America, but in rural areas too, that are embracing, a very anti-fascist and feminist, using those terms to define themselves. So I really do think that kind of upends some assumptions we have about global feminism, in the first half of the 20th century. But I also, I think that it's important to broaden our lens beyond activists who self-identify that way, for sure. So.
Yeah, absolutely. The terminology is just it's so muddy, right? In how it's deployed in different contexts as well, right? So, I mean, in terms of the cases that I look at, again, when I brought this up during oral histories, Chicanos were pretty clear that they said, no, don't call me a feminist, right? Like, we're Chicana and whatnot. Again, rather a repudiation of what they saw as this kind of, women only agenda of second wave feminism, right? And again, just these workers in maquilas, they were the ones that I'm looking at. They, again, in none of the arbitration cases that I've read, several hundred, none of them talk about feminism, right? It's mostly, again, working within this, working within these national institutions, right, to challenge what the federal government and the state governments are essentially allowing, which these workers see as undermining the goals, of the Mexican Revolution, even though it's essentially, 40 some odd years removed from 1920, right, from the conclusion of hostilities.
Right. I mean, it reminds me a little bit of like Vicky Ruiz's work in Cannery Women, Cannery Lives, connects again to Luisa Moreno, who I don't think self-identified as a feminist, but absolutely, if we're using a broad definition of feminism, not that is about sort of gender specific, they were pushing for maternity legislation for these working women, and acknowledge the sort of reproductive labor that they had to do, and also were fighting, against the exploitation that they were, had as workers. I mean, so I do think that, it's, and then what you're saying also reminds me too of how, in the 1975 International Women's Year Conference, for instance, there's a robust group of Latin American women against I think their group is like the Latin American Women Against Imperialism, who are trying to raise, you know, this is 1975, they're trying to raise issues of the Chilean dictatorship. They're trying to talk about the exploitation of minors in Bolivia. They're trying to, and they're challenging Betty Friedan and seeing her feminism as being far too, you know, narrow. And I don't think that they self-identify as feminist, you know? So I think, and meanwhile, there are other Latin American women who absolutely do self-identify as feminist, and yet they don't, you know, I just feel like I think like, yeah, feminism is such a capacious category that, but yeah, no, I'm really excited to read your work. I'm fascinated about maquiladora organizing especially, and yeah, interested in.
Oh, thank you. It's not, it doesn't end on a high note, but yeah.
Yeah, your ongoing struggles.
Yeah,
so,
yeah. Sarah, could I jump in with a much more contemporary question?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, because you had asked like earlier of like what can we learn, right? And so I wanna kind of bring it back to the 21st century. And so in talking about this, you know, about these terms, right? So you know, language is ever evolving, right? So, you know, it's I'm going to drop not a politically correct term right now, but, you know, it's not, we would go from colored people, right, to people of color, and now it's Black indigenous people of color, right? So like language is changing, right? With this term of feminist, today, do you see any pros, any cons to the way that activists today, that they call themselves, or label themselves, or the way that the media labels them, right? So I think, because I think one of the things that you're talking about when you talk about the term, how capacious the term feminism is, you know, do you call a person who doesn't consider themselves a feminist, do you call them a feminist in your work, right? As we talk about them, right? So in a way, it's about, you know, self-identification, right? And for 2020, right? For self-identification, and then versus the way that third parties or other media outlets refer to these activists in a both, you know, positive light or in a very negative light.
I mean, I'm just thinking about how I teach like my global feminisms class, and I do incorporate activism of women who do not self-identify as feminist in that class. And at the beginning of the class, we kind of collectively brainstorm about how do we define this term and what does it mean? And then, you know, I try to incorporate throughout the class sort of an understanding of how, you know, if they didn't self-identify as feminists, understanding, you know, why and what that meant to them. But I also think that you miss a lot of women's activism that really, I mean, if we're taking a really broad definition of sort of ending gender oppression or sexual oppression, you miss so much if you're only looking at people who wave the feminist word banner, you know? And so, yeah, I mean, a lot of indigenous women who were, I don't know, who have been engaged in struggles against sterilization, or welfare activists throughout, you know, United States, or, I mean, there are just so many examples of groups of women who were at the front lines of social justice based on issues around gender or sexuality, or that. So that is sort of my, you know, approach, is to sort of be aware of and cognizant. If you're using it anachronistically, like say that. I think there are ways, though, of identifying feminist arguments without using the label, like they are a feminist. It's not always necessary, but saying like, you know, I mean, I think feminist thought influences so much of what we do, even if we don't self-identify that way. And even, you know, I mean, I think that some workers, you know, I think like feminist legal work has influenced how some workers approach, you know, activism, for instance. So I just think that it's kind of seeped in to a lot of things. So I think it's important, though, to sort of highlight that legacy and that history. So
It's interesting because we had another panel discussion with two scholars about the ERA and Phyllis Schlafly, which of course then we had to talk about Mrs. America, the Hula ladies. And you know, there's this conversation right now of, does Phyllis Schlafly, who would never have called herself a feminist, but should we see her activism as feminist? She's a prominent woman with a very large and influential political platform. And I agreed with the two scholars who said absolutely not. We draw the line Schlafly, that we can have a definition that is large enough to include women who wouldn't have thought of themselves as feminist, but were nevertheless working on a project to end oppression. Oppression of sex and sexual orientation and gender, and about sort of control over their own bodies, but just being a powerful woman was not enough to make one feminist, right? So the definition has to be more elastic than it sometimes is portrayed in the media, but it snaps back when we get to Phyllis Schlafly and other people who actively work to advance capitalist or colonialist or racist or homophobic agendas.
It's interesting though, because I think as, you know, the suffrage centennial, we're looking back at, you know, some problematic suffragists from the first wave. I mean, Bertollet's herself kind of was enthusiastic about about British imperialism, really. I mean, so I feel like that's another question my students often come to me with, is like, how can this person have been a feminist though if they were racist, or if they, you know? And so I think that using these modifiers like imperial feminism or, I mean, I think imperial feminism is a really useful way of understanding, like Antoinette Burton writes about British women who used British imperialism in India as a way to advance their own rights. And so I think that, you know, it helps us to, I think you're right. I think that especially Schlafly, who never even claimed the term feminism, you know, it's like, just because she benefited from, you know, feminist advances, was able to get a, you know, law degree or whatever, like, it doesn't mean that she was ever said that she was trying to end, you know, or promote equality for, you know, the sexes. But I think there are these cases that are, you know, thornier of, you had, you know, in the, after the 90s and early 2000s, you had the US feminists who advocated invasion of Afghanistan because
going to bring up Laura Bush.
Yeah, and even the feminists, you know, even sort of more progressive, you know, feminists who advance that. So I think it's always good to be thinking about the fact that, yeah, there's so many different iterations of feminism, and embracing this language of gender equality. We can look, I guess that's why I appreciated these Latin American feminists I write about, who were combining multiple goals and seeing these things, never a single issue agenda around just gender equality, regardless of context or anything. And so, yeah, I think that the alliances they were able to forge on multiple issues was key to their kind of progressive vision.
Right. Women's activism does not equal feminism, right? Like, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I've been thinking a little bit as the two of you talk about the difference between the people that that Michael talks to in his study. Their primary experience is, I mean, so we can think of imperial feminism in two ways, right? One is sort of using feminist discourse to justify imperialism abroad. And then there's this kind of internalized racist feminism, right? Against indigenous people, against Black women, against immigrant women, undocumented women. And so, you know, so much of the experience of Chicano women in the United States has been bumping up against a definition of feminism that is largely white, largely middle class, you know, largely quote unquote professional women. And setting the agenda. And so for them, they just don't see themselves reflected in that. And I mean, I don't want to speak for them, but that's what I'm getting from what you're saying, that they identify with the labor movement, who's always had a very uncomfortable and fraught relationship with feminist organizing in the United States, you know. And what I so appreciated about the women that Katherine was talking about is precisely as you say, they have this intersectional, anti-colonial, and in many regards, anti-capitalist agenda that they see as holistic, right? And in the United States, you have some people embodying that, right? But very few. I mean, certainly Carrie Chapman Catt, you know, or, you know, some of the bigs, as, you know, when we refer to these white feminists, when we hold them up and allow them to define the movement, we miss the complexities of it. And yet what it seems like, Katherine, from your book, is that the really influential Latin American feminists, many of them got this bigger picture, you know, and they had they built important alliances, which I think white feminists have often not tried to build alliances in the United States, or not heard the voices of other people in their movements.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good way of putting it. And that's why I'm so appreciative of the way that the Centennial has been this opportunity to go back and look at, you know, the many women of color who were arguing for suffrage for, you know, multiple different reasons. The work of, you know, Martha Jones, Kathleen Cahill's new book, which looks at you know, Mexican American, Indigenous women, African American women who were critical to suffrage, Chinese American women too. So, and then even, you know, I think that I love Chicano Movidas, that book that you contributed to, Michael, because I think that while it, you know, it casts a broad net in terms of looking at different women's activism, and it also shows how, you know, many Chicanas tried to, you know, they claimed a Chicana feminism, one that was not, you know, that distinguished itself, like you said, Sarah, from the white second wave feminist organizing, but also, you know, rejected Chicano movement claims that didn't acknowledge sexual inequalities or sexual issues around sex and gender. And I think that, you know, it's really has been women of color who have always had the most intersectional visions of feminism because of their lived experiences. And so, yeah, I think that that's just it's nice to have this opportunity to kind of revisit some of these earlier histories, to see those more complex and intersectional visions.
Right, and though it's the centennial, right, and we're reflecting on, you know, suffrage in the United States. It doesn't end with suffrage, right? That is one component, right? So yes, it's the vote, but it's also a lot more things associated with that. So it's not just about like, and you talk about this, you know, extensively, Katherine, in your book, and you've also talked about it, you know, today. But yeah, how electoral politics and electoral, you know, the right to vote, it was just one facet of many that that women of color, both, well, I'll say women of color referring to the U.S., and then I'll say Latin American women referring to, right, Latin America. But yeah, how like women of color and Latin American feminists, the way that it wasn't that the goal didn't stop with the vote, right? The goal was not just to be able to go to the ballot box and then call it a day. No, it was an ongoing project that was it was challenging the inequalities inherent both in capitalism and in settler colonialism in many of these contexts, right? At the exclusion of Native American women, both in the U.S. and well, Native Americans at large in the United States and in Latin America, right? So I think it's, you know, and I think that I really appreciated, Sarah, you know, this kind of almost this unfinished business, right? Like these ongoing struggles for, you know, equality and equity. And if I can go back and I'm just trying to, you know, I have your question in mind, Sarah, of like, how can we apply some of these lessons for today? And so, you know, Katherine, what do you see as some of those lessons for today, right, as part of that unfinished project?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that there is a really still, I mean, maybe this is too historiographical of an answer, but I think that there is still this assumption that Latin America is not a source of innovation or ideas that we can learn from. And I really think that it's vital to to recast that understanding in our understanding of history, and to sort of look to I mean, a much broader canvas for these deeper histories of human rights and feminism. I mean, if you're talking about, you know, even the sort of the fact that Haiti was the first country that permanently banned slavery. I mean, I feel like Latin America has always been this crucible of quite innovative ideas about justice and rights. And I think that it continues to be, and I think that we have a sort of timeless understanding in some ways of Latin American history that is incredibly problematic, and that is connected to some, you know, to assumptions and discourses also around immigration in the United States and other, you know, and so I just think that at a really broad level, I would like to sort of puncture that notion of US exceptionalism and especially in terms of women's activism, because I continue to see how Latin American feminists continue to really be at the vanguard of thinking about these things connected in terms of capitalism, sexual violence from, you know, both the state and in personal lives, labor, I mean, including, you know, the energy and activism that maquiladora workers have been, you know, engaged in. So I guess I would just encourage, and this is work that I need to do myself too, is just to be sort of more active in learning and about these struggles and promoting a kind of transnational solidarity that is not one in which the US is teaching or offering itself as the model, but is offering solidarity and support in more meaningful ways.
And learning.
Yeah, absolutely. And learning. Yeah.
I mean, I don't think I could sum up the theme of the conference better than Michael did. So thank you for that. I sort of appreciate it. And Katherine, your response is really important. And I feel like, you know, what kind of keeps being in my head is, you know, when Hillary Clinton delivers her famous women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights, I mean, she's standing on the shoulders of giants, right? I mean, this is something that people have been doing, you know, primarily but not exclusively from the global South for a long time, is pushing the agenda, you know. And I even think when you think about the Constitution of South Africa and how it enshrines human rights, you know, into this really important document, in so many ways, these, you know, these global South countries, many of them former colonies, are putting human rights and women's rights at the very forefront of their national identities, you know, and their founding documents in ways that the United States, especially, and other European countries are just way behind on. I mean, we're the ones catching up, you know, whereas we're sort of, the United States is usually portrayed as the one sort of teaching everybody else.
Right. I mean, I think what's pretty, you know, even in, you know, in 2020, this kind of false notion that we progress and society somehow becomes better as the years go on, right? And that history is history and it's in the past and we can forget about it. What's it good for, right? Like so many of the, you know, so much of the backlash that I kept seeing against the, you know, El Violador eres tú, that chant, that song about, you know, the women saying that the state is complicit in rape and feminicides, right? A lot of those activists got a lot of backlash, right? And they were, you know, they were mocked in much similar ways that the feminists that you talk about, I can only imagine, were also dismissed, not just by North American and Anglo feminists from England, but also within like their own presses in their own countries.
Yeah, I mean, the state in Chile has really been repressing Las Tesis, that group that promoted that chant. I mean, you also think about the Berta Cáceres and Mariel Franco. I mean, these are also women who probably wouldn't have identified as feminists first, but were gender equality and sexual equality were fundamental parts of their organizing around anti-capitalism, around anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism, anti-racism. And really, I think those movements that they were promoting have been some of the strongest challenges to wing nationalism and powers that, like you said, are not just coming from the US, but coming from their own countries as well. And I just think it, yeah, I mean, I think that they too are kind of continuing this legacy of really robust Latin American women's activism that's incorporating gender oppression as a key part of their activism.
And can I jump on something that you mentioned, Sarah? Which is, you mentioned how like the United States is in many ways playing catch up, right? With a lot of these, positions coming from Latin America. And yet the many views in the United States are quite the opposite, right? Where despite these ideas being very, progressive and forward thinking and promoting equality and equity, the countries where they come from are often denigrated in the United States, right? So in talking about, Central America, right? There is a president of a particular country who calls these countries shithole countries, right? And so how, Katherine and Sarah, and I guess it's an open question to myself as well, but like, how do we reconcile that, right? Like, I mean, I see it as rather a product of the valorization of and the promotion of kind of this unapologetic capitalism, right? As opposed to a much more socially conscious way of living and organizing a society.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was, again, something I found so important about, I mean, the feminism that I was seeing in tracing in the book was that these Latin American feminists knew that they were like at the vanguard of these, they were absorbing to some degree these kind of, racist notions from other countries that I mean, shithole countries, excuse my language, but they were also really aware that they were kind of in the lead. And I think that Marixa Lasso's recent book, Erased, about the way that the US displaced an enormous population of people when they created the Canal Zone in Panama. She also does a brilliant job of basically showing how Panama and Colombia were at the vanguard of, of liberalism. You had these Black political leaders in Panama who were promoting these really robust notions of democracy that the US was instrumental actually in removing from power. And so I feel like, US imperialism is just an inextricable part of the story of how that notion came to be. And I think that it's not the full answer, and certainly Latin American elites who are working around these capitalist collaborations with the US were participating absolutely in that. But I think that is such an important piece of it as well.
Yeah, well, I agree. I mean, one of the reasons that I think I just became really laser focused on wanting to interview Katherine and talk more about your work is that I think the intersectional analysis moving forward is key, and the coalition building is key too. I mean, these women formed, that you talk about in your book, form really important coalitions. Sometimes they form uncomfortable coalitions. Sometimes they form coalitions, based on sort of a larger strategic good, but it's always a really intersectional sort of long range, eyes on a more equal society that they have their focus on. And that's a kind of, I guess, a capacious understanding of their politics that many of the activists in the United States didn't have. And I suppose we could say many of the activists in the United States still don't have. I mean, I think the commemorations of suffrage have been really important for conversations about Indigenous women and Black women and how they're shut out of so many of the kind of mainstream feminist suffragist movements. But also this international focus, I think, is so key to understanding the suffrage movement and also key to affecting change moving forward. I mean, I'm a transnational historian, so of course I would think that's the answer. But these transnational coalitions are so important, not only in forming movements of solidarity across borders, but also in checking the power of the state.
Right.
You know,
That's true.
yeah, and building these, you know, relief organizations and having a more inclusive understanding of human rights, not just at the national level, but the international level.
Right. And yeah, they were sort of using these sort of proto-human rights instruments to challenge state power, you know, often. So yeah, I think that's an important part. Thanks.
Well, I just really want to thank you both. This was a really fascinating conversation. Thank you for letting me listen and letting me learn. I really appreciated the focus on sort of making this commemoration of suffrage more transnational and more international. So thank you to Katherine and thank you to Michael for joining me. I really appreciate that. And everybody come back for our other conversations at Constitution Day.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Katherine.